Participants being added. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join APMA today for our webinar focusing on return to work during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now that we are a number of weeks into self-isolation, many of you are starting to look at what a return to work will look like, especially in how you will function and operate in this new normal. So with news of some OEMs thinking about going back to work and restarting their operations in May, this means suppliers will need to be up and running ahead of that, in advance of that. So for some of you, this reality is also being supported by the Canada Wage Subsidy, which is opening up on April 27th, just a reminder for those who will be applying. So this subsidy will be helping quite a few of our members and others have the opportunity to bring people back to work sooner than expected. So I will hand it over to Flavio in just a second. A few quick housekeeping items. Everyone has been put on mute for the duration of this webinar. Questions will be answered at when the three of us have had the opportunity to wrap up. You can use the Q&A option. The box is at the bottom of your screen to ask a question. You can also check a little box if you would like for your name to be hidden. And just a reminder that we are recording this webinar and we will post it later on our website so that you can share with others in your organization. So with that, I will hand it over to Flavio.
Thank you, Lauren, and thanks, Peter. Peter is a friend of ours. Peter is a partner at KPMG. He's the national sector leader for the automotive group. A lot of you know him through his extensive M&A and financing experience in our industry. We know him as a friend. We count on his advice. This is the first time I see him in his Clark Kent getup, and you're calling us from your Palace of Solitude, wherever it is in the North Pole. I appreciate you joining us. And Peter's going to start us off with some insight here. And well, over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Flavio, and thank you, Lauren, and hello, everybody. This is an extremely important webinar, and I wanted to extend thanks to Flavio and the APMA for taking this initiative. It's relatively certain that the business interruption from the COVID-19 pandemic will have an adverse economic impact on global GDP for the remainder of the year. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. And the most recent projection from the International Monetary Fund projects a global contraction of about 3%, with Canada and the US experiencing declines of approximately 6% for each of us for 2020. Now, assuming the mitigation strategies and financial stimulus are effective, and for those of you who haven't been keeping track, there's a substantial amount of financial stimulus heading into the market. We should see a bounce back in the economy, and the projected recovery is fairly sharp in 2021, with growth of about 5.8%. The US is expected to grow by 4.7% and Canada by 4.2%. There's always a uncertainty regarding the global forecast, but I think the point of the matter is plan for a gradual recovery with a strong recovery in 2021, and I think that's the best advice that we can take. If we turn our attention to Canada, the performance of the auto industry is a very significant barometer of economic activity and consumer confidence. Car sales are referred to all the time as a measuring stick. And the auto industry is truly one of the most globally connected industries in the world. As a critical part of the manufacturing sector, it has significant spin-off effect. It plays an important role in Canada's GDP. In general, manufacturing ranks second and accounts for 10% of our GDP. And when you combine it with warehousing and transportation, it's the single largest determinant of our economic well-being. Now, as part of the newly formed USMCA, the trade agreement, it's essential that Canada maintain pace with its trading partners to the south, and you're going to hear more about that from Flavio later on. It's important the overarching issue here, it's important to understand that, the economic downturn is not caused by a traditional breakdown in fundamentals. It's different. And prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, unemployment in both the US and Canada were at historic lows. Canada probably at a 43-year historic low or so. And there was, and generally still is, an abundance of available capital in the market. The cost of capital is low, although public equity markets have been volatile. The economic downturn really has been caused by deliberate shutdown of consumer activity. So when you look at it, the most critical factor in our ability, North America's ability, global ability, to restore the economy to its former operating level is the ability to restore confidence in consumer spending. And all of your employees are consumers. If we don't build them, they can't buy them. And if they're not employed, they can't afford them. So, the Canadian industry really has to set an example, must set an example for how to restore manufacturing activity in a safe and effective manner for its workforce. It needs to be one of the beacons that helps the standard and set a standard for others to follow, and I think it will. So with that, thank you. Thank you, Lauren, and back over to you, Lauren and Flavio.
Thanks, Peter. So, Lauren, I'll take everybody through here a bit of a premise.
Excellent.
And then I'll put it over to Lauren to get into some of the best practices that I think are being shared in the industry, and I think would be of benefit to those of you who are dialed in today. The most important premise that I use when I'm speaking to government and I'm speaking publicly to media is, in the Canadian automotive supplier sector, we don't choose when we go back. Our OEM customers choose when they're going to go back. So this isn't a question, the larger question of, are we ready to go? We got to be ready to go. And the only choice you have is, do you want that business or not? If you're not ready to go back, step aside, somebody else will. And so our focus is on, how are we going to do this properly? How are we going to do it in a way that invokes both confidence in regulators as well as the market? Peter was very correct in saying that one of the most important things is that if we do a confident return to work and a sustainable return to work, across North America, there are 3 million people that work in the automotive supply and automotive assembly business, with another 3 times that in retail, and probably another 5 times that in the industries that support it. This is a nice core group that, if we go back in a sustainable fashion, might also help to kickstart that market. The market, I'll get to the market in a second. So we're talking about going back to work, and the reason that we're doing it today on April 24th is that almost all of our OEM customers are suggesting that the week of May the 4th will be the one that they're going to send their plants back up to work. There are some staggered plans, plant by plant. We see some for May the 11th, some for the week of the 18th. But generally, we're all looking at a restart around the week of May the 4th. This is an incredibly integrated industry through the 3 countries. I'm sure I don't have to tell the people who are on this webinar, but it's also a very important point because we need to know where the other 2 countries are. The federal guidance from the Trump administration last week was, here's a plan for reopening, but the jurisdiction is a state-level jurisdiction. And so here's the federal guidance. Certainly, I think we all know, we just turn on the TV or turn on Twitter, we know that the president isn't going to stand in the way. The question is, on those key automotive states, both in the Midwest and in the Southeast, where are they? And for the most part, I mean, we'll get into it a little bit later. Michigan is a bit of a deeper question, but the rest of them are all eager to go. What's Mexico doing? Well, the Mexican president several weeks ago declared automotive a non-essential business. And the debate in Mexico is, how are we going to be able to ensure the supply that the Mexican plants are going to stay in, are going to be up for business when it's time for us to get those components or get those actual assembly plants going. The guidance from the president in person at a press conference a week and a half ago was, when the American auto industry goes back up, he will declare the parts sector and the rest of the Mexican auto sector essential 3 to 5 days before. We're expecting some guidance again today. We're coordinating closely with our counterparts in Mexico, but also the Assembly Association there. All associations in the 3 countries, parts and assembly, are all signed on the same page, asking for a coordinated restart effort between the 3 countries and down to the state and provincial level. The only other time I remember being all on the same page in writing was on fair treatment on rules of origin for NAFTA. So we've continued with that spirit of engagement, that spirit of cooperation. We're sharing all of that information, and some of that Lauren's going to go through with. In Canada, we have the Canadian Automotive Partnership Council. It's a permanent body that has the 5 OEMs that manufacture here, 5 permanent representatives from the parts sector, organized labor, academia, and the federal and provincial industry ministers from Ontario and Quebec. We're meeting again today as a council. We're working together on sharing the best practices and protocols on how to open properly, how to do that with confidence for both regulators and the general public, and proper safe workplaces. The point that we're making in all of those is that our business has led for decades on safety standards in our operations. And we all operate, anybody who does a tour of a plant knows that we already restrict where people can and cannot go. The switch to bringing in the principles of social distancing into a production plant is part of the rigor that we've pioneered decades ago. What's the market look like? Well, AFS as of April 15th was predicting that sales for 2020 are going to be around 12.25 million units for the U.S. market. But what's really important is where are inventories on the nameplates that you are supplying, inventories for the companies, for the OEMs that you are supplying. Those inventories adjusted for this new predicted SAR for Canadian assembly plants and nameplates assembled in Canada are anywhere between 55 and 90 days. Some of those are bleeding into a territory that I think necessitates this conversation to include dealers and what are we doing at point of sale. Those voices are represented at CAPC and are represented in those the 3-country association coordination. There are some nameplates that have inventories, adjusted inventories that look like 150 days. So it's really important to know those, to know who you're supplying, and to understand that external dynamic is one that is going to be only driven by the market. We can say as many confident things as we want. How do people feel? And lastly, before I hand it back over to Lauren, what's very important and is somewhat gone quiet over the last month or so is there is an entry into force date for the new USMCA, CUSMA, whatever we're calling it in Mexico. There are new rules, and those rules will enter into force on July 1st. And there is a real debate happening between the public and the private sector right now on whether they will be enforced on July the 1st. That's another element for all of us to consider. We are waiting for uniform regulations. We've never been in a situation where here's a whole bunch of rules that are dramatically different than the old ones, and we don't have the regs in place, and you're going to do it in 2 months. I think a lot of those pressures, including this COVID economic shutdown, will force that enforcement date into a later date. The entire industry has asked for the enforcement date to be January the 1st. We've got commitment from the Canadian federal government that they would go there if the Americans would relent. Canada would not enforce a July 1st date if the Americans went to January 1st. So we're all working on USTR. With that, I think I see that we've got a record number of participants today, and they want to hear about what a reopened workspace looks like. And I think I'll hand it back to you, Laura.
Thank you. So I'm going to take a look at best practices that a lot of our members have been talking about. Speaking with different members, big and small, this is a huge demand and a huge question that a lot of people are asking, not only focusing on the safety of employees, but understanding where the industry best practices are so that everyone is in line and everyone is providing a safe workspace. So I will, and also just to let everyone know, you can continue to ask questions. I see there's already one. If you have questions as we go through this, that's fine. You can plug them in, and then once we wrap up, we'll go ahead and start answering them. So taking a look at best practices, currently a lot of our members and other companies are looking at a return to work. With the OEMs making those announcements looking in May, this is the new reality about there is pressure that what will it look like when our employees return. Speaking with a lot of different companies, right now, discussions are happening between HR and employees who are at home, whether they are looking to stay on the emergency response benefit, which is the $2,000 a month, whether they choose to be furloughed, sometimes at the 75% wage subsidy, or whether they are interested in returning to work, and whether that's the 75% or if there's an opportunity for top up if they do choose to go through CEWS. So there's a lot of different situations happening with different employees, and I think that's important to remember as we walk through best practices, that these conversations should be happening directly with employees to figure out what is currently happening in their life, if they're a vulnerable worker, if they're taking care of others. So then you have a real sense that when you're looking at the critical work that needs to be filled and rearranging the workplace, you understand the number of employees that are initially returning. So this information is both collected from across industry and as well as conversations with government, and in particular the Ministry of Labor. And while there hasn't been any new legislation yet in relation to what those workplaces will look like and protocols and procedures, this is really just looking at both the standards that they're looking for when they show up in a workplace, and also the best practices that go above and beyond collected from our industry. So I'll first start with procedures, looking at some of the requirements that are outlined by the Ministry of Labor. It's still all relatively the same, similar to what you're already practicing in your organizations. Inspections right now are complaint-based. They're not doing proactive inspections of workplaces. They may start with restaurants in the coming weeks, but industry will not be a priority for them. Right now, it's mostly employees in the workplace who are concerned and feel that their workplace is not up to standards and they don't have safety protocols, and that's when we have inspectors showing up. The first thing that inspectors will be looking for is, do you have an updated policy or procedure that falls under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, but is it updated in relation to COVID-19? It'll look at, I think it's the spreadable infection section. They'll be looking for an update there and how you are currently looking to respond to COVID-19 in the workplace. And then they'll be asking if all of your employees have been trained. That will be one of the key ones, whether it's just a document that people have done online training, have done in-person training at 6 feet apart or more. But they'll be looking for signatures and documentation to say that not only those in the workplace, but those who will be returning or even working remotely, that everyone is up to date on that new training. Very similar to what you're currently doing with the WMIS, for example. They'll also be looking at what your next steps will be. So in your procedure and in your training with employees, if someone did test positive in your workplace, what are your next steps? So contact tracing, how you choose to isolate that person, next steps for staff in the company, reporting to the ministry, and what it will look like when that individual returns to work. It's really thinking about every step that an employee takes from the moment that they drive into the parking lot, all throughout the workplace, and when they leave. Are you making sure that there's safety measures every step of the way? And another piece I'll mention is that while screening isn't mandatory, it is strongly recommended by the Ministry of Labor. Screening can take any number of forms, whether it's people checking in online or through an app or in person with a security guard doing a questionnaire. They can do temperature checks themselves, or if your workplace chooses to administer temperature checks, but some level of screening to talk about whether they've traveled in 14 days, had contact with anyone, or if they have any symptoms. And the Government of Ontario does have a self-assessment tool if you need to look for a resource for that. So looking at next steps, you should be reviewing and updating your policies and procedures, assessing the best way to deliver training to your staff who are both on-site and off-site. Develop that training and identify the critical work so that you understand exactly what roles need to be filled immediately to meet customer demands, and who can work from home, and what's the individuals who are on maybe the government subsidies, what their return to work will look like. And then, especially important, employee safety first, being able to identify those who are vulnerable, considered vulnerable, whether they have underlying health conditions or in relation to age, making sure you're identifying them and taking extra precautions. The next step, looking at training. So training should occur in many formats and be ongoing. There should be access to training online, in person, through emails, etc. And it will continue to change. So we see a continuation of new updates and new decisions from government, whether it's social distancing, self-isolation, closing down non-essential services. So it's important to continue to update your training and it evolve as the pandemic evolves as well. So it's important to keep everyone informed and share information for transparency. Maybe training for janitorial staff will be much different than those who are working in offices, but it's important to share that information with everyone so that they understand how each person in your organization plays a part into maintaining a safe and healthy workplace. And outcomes of training, everyone should be able to understand the new procedures, understand what social distancing looks like, hand and workplace hygiene are excellent topics, and proper use of PPE if required. These are only a few of the different topics to be covered. And information on training expectations should be shared in advance of returning to work. And so even if on the first day of returning to work, you do have people maybe in a small classroom, or you have a manager walking through the training, they should be notified in advance what that training looks like and what the expectations are so that there's transparency in relation to it. And just going through my notes, we cover everything. And again, just sharing information on how other teams are being trained, especially in relation to HR. People want to understand what their responsibilities are, not in just for themselves, but in relation to others, especially if you're back on an assembly line, for example, and in close contact. So looking at those topics of training, talking about hand washing, etc., looking at how to create a safe workspace. So a return to work is going to mean that you're calling employees first, and that should be your first stage of screening, is that when you're calling employees about returning to work, you should be asking them, gathering information about their travel, if they've had any symptoms, and if they've had any contact with others. And really just checking in on mental health as well is important, because this has been a really demanding time. And so it won't be returning back to a normal workplace. It will look very different. And so mental health is really important in that transition. While it's not mandatory to do screening, it is strongly recommended, and looking at industry best practices to date, pretty much everyone is planning to have some level of screening and self-assessment. Many of them include temperature checks at home, and if people don't have the ability to do a temperature check at home, how do they get access to, say, a thermometer, or can we do something on site? even looking at the thermometers that they use for food temperature, it's contactless. You kind of just aim it at someone's forehead. Even that is a simple solution. So there's a lot of opportunity. Social distancing. So this is one of the biggest concerns that's been flagged to the ministry for their inspections, is that when people return to work, they feel that there is not enough room, there's less than 6 feet, and they're not being provided with any of the proper safety equipment or PPE. So it's important that to recognize each individual's concerns and address them within your organization, because the ministry has seen such a significant increase in complaints, and it has been over 90% from workers. So being able to resolve it internally as opposed to the ministry showing up. And I will note that the Ministry of Labor is not actively going out and issuing fines, that when a worker does complain, the ministry is showing up to educate. Maybe it's educating the worker to say that the workplace is indeed safe, or it's informing the workplace, here's the changes that you need to make, and then they'll do a follow-up. Right now, because everyone has so many questions, that's their goal right now, is to show up and educate and bring people in line. So part of social distancing, it can look like many different things depending on the layout of your workplace. So physically removing people and creating space on the plant floor. This includes looking at bathrooms, change rooms, lunch rooms, smoking areas, and common areas. So whether it's a staggered shift or split shift, to reduce the amount of contact that each individual has, and not crowding other places. It may be so limiting those people on their shifts, or being able to minimize the number that they come into contact with. So if you have the same 20 people on one shift, so if one person becomes ill, contact tracing becomes much easier because they've only been with that 20, as opposed to changing the shifts up all the time and being exposed to different people continuously. There's also the opportunity to create physical barriers. So putting up plexiglass, for example, or moving machines around so that instead of everyone being in a row, that maybe they're staggered and they're on opposite sides, if that's possible. And then the other option is that if you can't create 2 meters or less, that those individuals are wearing something like a face mask or other PPE. That has been the biggest concern flagged for the ministry, is that they are not able to get that 6 feet of distance, and that they're not being provided with face masks. So solution will look like a combination of all of these things. It won't just be one or two. It's what makes sense for you, what's also financially feasible, and creating safe space for employees, because ultimately it's just giving them the confidence to feel safe when they show up to the workplace. I'll briefly cover cleaning. It's pretty basic. So the ministry is looking for a minimum of twice a day that areas should be cleaned, especially common areas and high-touch surfaces. Nothing special is needed. Basic bleach and water mixture is more than enough, but you should be using paper towels or disposable materials and not reusing materials. You should be cleaning before and after a shift, or when someone new comes into the space. This isn't just about sanitizing the area, but it's also about giving the employee a sense of safety. And one of the biggest areas of concerns is education around hand hygiene, because this is how so much is being transferred by contact on different surfaces. Hand hygiene is something that most people are unaware of, or they're doing it incorrectly. And so putting up posters and signs, doing the training, and it really is focusing on 20 to 30 seconds of washing your hands. And this includes hand sanitizer as well. That 5 seconds that you're quickly rubbing it over your hands won't cut it. It does need to be between 15 and 20 seconds to be effective. And something that's especially important for industry is that if your hands are soiled, so if they have grease, hand sanitizer is not effective. It can't break down through the grease and actually access the surface of your hands. So installing hand washing stations and hand sanitizer stations are of equal importance. So I will quickly take a look at education and communications, and then I'll go through a few resources. So ultimately, the safety of your employees comes first, and the message needs to be crystal clear on that. Yes, you're going to put in all of these important protocols, but talking to employees and making sure that they have a clear understanding and that there are avenues open for them to communicate any issues they have should be a priority. Information should be positive and reinforce health and safety practices. Negative information or negative language can contribute to a negative work environment. So keeping it positive and making sure that everything you're communicating is proactive efforts. Yes, if someone tests positive, you will have to go into, jump into like a risk management situation, but be proactive. Explain the steps that are being taken and why this has to happen. And the ministry will be looking for signs and posters, not just within the building, but in common areas, outside, in the parking lot. All of this should be communicated from the moment they drive in to the moment that they leave. And while many smaller companies obviously don't have resources or expertise on how to develop some of these materials, looking at trusted sources. So the federal and provincial governments and many of their agencies are putting out information, and also go to the tier 1 suppliers. Many of them have the capacity and the expertise, and if you are part of their supply chain, it's important that you go to them not only for information, but they would probably appreciate you practicing the same things that they're doing. So right now, with so many people returning to work, it'll be most important to communicate with other organizations as well. So I'll just do a quick rundown of some resources that you can take a look at. If everyone has a pen available. So Ministry of Labor, they actually have a contact center who is willing to take any questions that you have about your workplace. This can be both from employees or from management. So if you have a concern that maybe something in your workplace is not quite right, or you have questions about how to rectify it, the phone number is 1-877-202-0008. I believe they're only open 8:30 to 5. I'd have to double check, but they are a fantastic resource. And then, so if you do have an inspector show up, another check mark to say that yes, you've reached out. Public Health Ontario has some great videos and pamphlets available to print on hand washing and hand hygiene and safe workspace. The tier 1s talk to other companies, and of course our APMA website. If you go on the homepage, we have a COVID-19 page. This is not just information about what's coming from the industry, but also information coming out of government and looking at subsidies as well. And of course, I am always available for contact as well, and I will post my information in the chat box. So if anyone does have follow-up questions after or over the coming weeks, I am available to chat. So I will now open it up for questions. Oh, and we have a few. So I will ask the question, and then I think between the three of us, we can figure out some answers. So question 1, does the Canadian Parts Council recommendations include provincial, federal requirements as active today?
So I'm going to take a shot at interpreting this. I guess whoever was asking this is it current with what the current provincial federal requirements are? And the answer is yes. We work daily, multiple touch points with both levels of government, from everything from the industry ministry to labor and health. Any recommendations that we're making are informed by those contacts, but more importantly, anybody who wants to be put in direct contact, we're happy to step out of the way for that. And if you send me an email or you send Lauren an email, and you can send it a general email to info@apma.ca, or you can send it to me, fvolpe@apma.ca. I'll make sure that it gets get you connected to the right people in Ontario, Quebec, or in Ottawa. And if you want to make a similar contact into the US and you don't know where to do that, tell me what state you're looking for, and I'll connect you to our counterparts who we deal with on a daily basis at the OESA or MEMA. And I'll also offer up, if you're very specific about where you need advice in Mexico, I'll connect you to Oscar Albin, my counterpart in Mexico as well.
So the next question, in terms of AFS projected 2020 sales, is the figure of 12.25 MIL units for US only or North America total?
So I'll touch that, and maybe Peter, you might want to talk a little bit about demand. That the AFS number is the US number. It's the annualized SAR as of April 15th. Peter?
Yeah, no, that's the US number, and the latest North American numbers I've seen, they range anywhere between 14.5 to 15 million units. That ranges.
Sure. Sorry, Peter.
Let's go ahead.
Canadian number is, DesRosiers has been putting out guidance figures that show the Canadian number having the kind of dramatic drop that you all expect that is proportional with the American one. The recovery is going to be driven in part by how people feel, and in an unprecedented, we are in an unprecedented market in terms of usage of the end product. In 2009, 2010, when the world fell apart, people were still leaving the house and using their cars. And so one of the things that I think we need to understand is that for the last month and a half, 2 months in some scenarios, people aren't using the product. And how does that affect their ideas towards replacement? How does that affect their decisions? If you're on a CRB or CWS, how does your personal liquidity affect your decision? One of the things that we're hopeful is that if the industry goes back writ large and it's sustainable, it's a sizable population and it's a sizable market segment, and that in coordination with, in the US, of course, in coordination with NADA, and here, of course, where the CADA is part of the Canadian Automotive Partnership Council, that's part of the planning process, that some coordination at the retail end will help to pull those numbers. Peter, you and I have had discussions about what we think 2021 looks like writ large for the economy. Maybe you can reflect a little bit on that, and I guess some of us can infer a little bit of your wisdom into what we think the auto market looks like.
Yeah, just to add to what you were saying, Flavio, I think the industry is counting very much on the replacement cycle that's sort of built in to automotive sales. You know, a substantial number of vehicles are financed. A substantial number of vehicles since the recovery of the financial crisis have been leased, and automakers generally like that because there's a natural replacement cycle. Like I said, I don't see that declining into 2021. I am optimistic that if the measures that we put in place are adhered to, 2021 will see a bounce back. I think there is pent-up demand, and very different, fundamentally different from 2008, 2008, 2009. There is an abundance of capital. The cost of capital is low. I expect it to continue to be low. And what central governments are trying to avoid, and let's make it very clear for all the listeners, is deflation. If there's a little bit of inflation and strong economic rebound, that's exactly what they're looking for, given the amount of money they borrowed. So, it's very clear to me. I see a bounce back. I think, will 2022 get back to where we were in 2019 or the last half of 2021? That's what I'm thinking about. And I continue to remain confident that things will return to normal. The fundamentals were very strong, and I don't see any reason for them to change in 2021, subject to, of course, making sure we have enough consumer confidence.
Thanks, Peter.
Excellent. Thank you. Looking at the next question, does the APMA have a sample policy procedure that checks all the boxes that the Ministry of Labor is looking for to help employers put this together? Working with the ministry, there wasn't necessarily a list that they provided. I can definitely put something together and do a follow-up call to have them review it or see if there's been any updates on their end as well. There is on the, I will add it, if it's not already on the APMA website, I will add it shortly after. There is a handout from the Ministry of Health looking at industry and some of the best practices there that they're looking for. So I'll have that posted on our website. But I will look to post something probably in the coming week and work with the Ministry of Labor to do that, since the question's been raised, and probably something that others need as well. So yes, I will go ahead with that. Next question, how often should employees be screened or self-assessed? This should be happening daily. The expectation is for it to happen daily. So every time that they show up for their shift, they should be screened or going through a self-assessment. The idea is that temperature changes, contact with different people, all of these change daily when the person goes home or goes grocery shopping, etc. And so for best practices and to keep everyone safe and to be able to limit spread in your organization, these screening or self-assessments should be happening daily. And just a reminder that anyone who doesn't pass any of these steps, so that they have traveled or they have been in contact or they have any of the symptoms, they should be sent home. That as soon as one of those boxes can't be checked, they should not be entering the workplace, and they should work remotely or be sent home, whatever that looks like. But that is the purpose of the self-assessment, to be able to keep everyone else in the workplace safe.
Let me add one thing to that, Lauren. This is a protocol that's being used writ large. You know, auto supplier sector, business and beyond. It's a simple checklist. Hospitals, healthcare centers have the simple checklist that is, here's a very simple list of symptoms. And I think maybe what we'll do, Lauren, is we'll share the checklist that UHN uses. We just saw it yesterday, that you might use for your self-screening and self-assessment, that both to protect the employee and the employer, but also is one of those things that within a couple of work days, people start getting used to the kinds of things that they'll be asked the next day at work. And so that you'll also encourage them that if symptoms arise between shifts, they can also inform you beforehand, before they show up, so that it can help in your planning. If you know that you've got a sore throat the night before when you go to sleep and you have trouble breathing, you're obviously not going to be coming in the next day. And what we would encourage is this is a very open dialogue between our employees and scheduling management.
Yeah, one thing I'd add, Flavio, is that I think, you know, if this is implemented successfully and, you know, the auto industry, again, can demonstrate that it has a workforce that's working properly and safely, because, you know, this is an industry that's accustomed to big open spaces and a lot of employees. It really will set a standard. It will inspire confidence to others. So I think it's of crucial importance that, you know, everybody does everything they can to adhere to those standards.
Looking at another question, are most tier ones mandating masks for low risk jobs, or are they making them available for the employee to decide if they would like to wear them?
This is a question that everybody's asking. It's a question you should think about as you start talking about PPEs. The question before that is physically looking at your workplace. Are you going to have, is there no way for you in many cases to create a sustainable distance between your employees? In those cases, you should be able to inventory how many of those employees would be inside that catchment, you know, within the 2 meter guidance, and then start counting how many shifts they'll be doing a week, and what your expected rate at full capacity would be for a month, and then do the homework to find out that you can get a mask. You don't need an N95 mask, but you might need a ASTM level 2 or 3 mask. You want to be able to communicate to your employees, if you're going to make something available, you're going to make it available in these scenarios, and here's the frequency I'm going to make them available. But the last thing you want to do is say that it's available and then not have it available, because you're going to cause obvious problems and unobvious ones. It isn't We aren't making that specific guidance, and neither is the Ministry of Labor or the Ministry of Health. But what we're doing at the Canadian Automotive Partnership level, and in conjunction with OESA and with ENA, is to see if we can't share and come to a very basic protocol guidance. We have a meeting this evening, and we're meeting early next week, and we will be providing some insight into what's happening there. One of the things you're going to want to look at is your OEM customer that you're supplying. Ask for guidance from them. What kind of guidance are they giving on PPEs? And it would be good advice to be able to follow what they're doing.
Next question. How soon can we expect all the workforce on both engineering and manufacturing fronts return to pre-COVID-19 times? How soon will there be any shuffling, recruiting in roles?
You know, the questions like that sometimes sound obvious, but they aren't really. It really depends on who your customer is and what program they're on. We've seen some of the OEM guidance being week 1 will be 50%, week 2, 75%, and then week 3, 100%. We've seen others say that they're going to start at 75%. The biggest external guidance dynamic on that is where are the inventories on that, and what's their distribution network look like. We fully expect that using the adjusted SAR and scheduling against that SAR, that within the month we'll be back at full capacity or full bore against that SAR. You're going to see some careful step-ups, and Peter, I'm going to hand this over to you in a second, but you're going to see some careful step-ups because in some scenarios, for example, UAW plants, UAW suggested yesterday in a story that made it to the Detroit Free Press that they're not comfortable with the timing of the restart in early May. Now we're having that conversation on April 23rd. That might be part of a really deep back and forth. But on the flip side, we've heard Unifor say we are working together with the companies on their start dates. The OEMs did not come up with a restart plan that did not include negotiation and discussion with their unions. But I also expect a little bit of turbulence from company to company over the course of May.
Yeah, what I'd add, Flavio, is that I think people have to very much adhere to the guidance around the new SAR, the new production levels. I think this is a reality. It's not. It's very unrealistic to assume that we would return to 2019 levels. So you know what? If we're 14 to 15 million units, 14.5 million units in North America, that's what it will be, and people will be producing to that level. I do see a ramp up more gradual, as you described it, Flavio. I think we have to look to November and December to see just how well the recovery is taking hold, and what they're going to do with inventories that are on hand today. As you say, if we've got a lot of inventory, you know, it's going to be an issue. The other dynamic in this whole thing is, you know, the retailers have to open as well. We have to sell these vehicles. You know, we can produce them all we want, but we've got to sell them. And, you know, in my discussions with the Toronto Dealers Association and others, you know, that's going to also be a concerted effort on how to get the consumer back into the showroom, how to push, you know, vehicles that are coming off lease, taking care to make sure there's an orderly used market, as all of you can relate. There's a whole daisy chain of effects here that impact prices and the movement of inventory and everything else. So a lot has to happen. Suffice to say, I think you're generally right. I think that in 60 days we'll be kind of back to the level of production that we expect for the remainder of the year at that level. And then, you know, hopefully you'll see a gradual move up. I don't see it until November and December, but that's generally the thinking as it stands today.
Thanks, Peter.
Next question. Someone asked the question if the webinar will be available after. Yes, we will be posting it on our website for you to share or review. Another question, is the APMA working closely with the BDC, EDC, and banks to get their funding out ASAP? It appears to be very slow.
The short answer is yes. The long answer is, this is client to client differences in dynamics. If you have specific questions and/or you're a member and you want a little bit of intervention, happy to do it. Contact us offline, and we'll help you with those discussions. But yes, the EDC and the BDC are at the highest levels are working very closely with us, and so hopefully we can move the needle for you.
Yeah, one thing I'd add, Flavio, is that you can appreciate a lot of our clients have asked us these same kinds of questions. The EDC and the BDC are at capacity with applications and questions and concerns. There's no substitute for preparedness. Going in there and making it as easy as possible is the fastest way to get capital if you need it.
Okay, the next question. Can we bring U.S. citizens in to perform service or training that the supplier does not have available in Canada, specifically on a new machine that was just purchased and need to bring in an applications person to train our people in Windsor next week?
Boy, who asked that question? Hey, Tony. Look, you asked the question because there isn't an easy answer to that, and that gets into Global Affairs Canada and their counterparts in the U.S. Right now, the reason there isn't a clear question is the definition on both sides of the border on what an essential worker is, but also the catchment of, on the Canadian side, you bring this person in, person regardless of who they are is going to have to quarantine. And so I think what you're really asking is, are we able to bring experts in and then have them return? In the current reality, you probably, if you use somebody, that person is iced in place for 14 or 15 days. Those are specific conversations that we're having with Global Affairs Canada on what's really important for us to be able to get back up. It's part of the discussion. We're hoping to get some guidance next week that I can give you the answer that says, for the most part, the rules and dynamics of that were the same before the economy went into the deep freeze. It is a real concern and a potential critical fail point. We've pointed out to government officials on both sides of the border, and I should say also in Mexico, that these specialists are not hanging around waiting for work somewhere. That they're in short supply, and that if we have to create a separate class for them, we should, and we're on it. And hopefully, if you tune back in next week, we've got some clarity for you.
Next question, should an employee exhibit COVID symptoms while at work, what is the guidance with respect to action? Test results may not be available for some days. The result, which can be that the positive or negative. When should employers act, and specifically what measures should be taken? So I would highly recommend checking in with Ministry of Labor on specifics of this. Generally what I've seen, not just in industry practices, but in those initial discussions with labor, the first step would be to isolate the individual. So whether that's looking at isolating them into, they go to their car or they go into a space in the workplace, having them return home for self-isolation. So this is why it's important to do the screening every day, so that if they did have any symptoms before they came into work, or if they did have a fever, that they should be staying home, which would help reduce the employee being in the workspace. If they do have any symptoms, they should be notifying their doctor, and that the company also has the opportunity to either notify public health or notify the Ministry of Labor that they have suspected, and ask about the next steps. Waiting until testing, the test results come back is important, and self-isolation is important, because many people who may feel that they have symptoms and then choose to stay home may not necessarily get tested, but choose to quarantine for 2 weeks. So it's important that you're removing the person from the workplace, sending them home, and then also being able to identify who else in that workplace has had contact, and notifying them. Open communication is very important in order for other employees to feel safe. And then if that person does have symptoms, being able to close down that section or any areas that they've been in contact with. And as a preventative measure, using any sort of disinfectant to clean down that area. Clean down, whether they went to the washroom, the lunchroom, what doorknobs they touched, being able to kind of track that employee's movements throughout the company, and sanitize. And so what that timeline looks like really depends. If you're able to close it down and kind of leave it off for the rest of the day and do a deep cleaning. Some companies are bringing in third parties to deep clean, not just for their expertise in it, but it does bring a real sense of comfort to the rest of the employees, and that it's not necessarily the janitorial staff who need to jump in. So that's been a strong recommendation, especially for employee morale. And I think that is pretty much it. But I would say that it would be important to contact the Ministry of Labor in those situations to notify them, and then notify them of what your next steps are. Is any government level recommending mask use in the workplace by all employees?
So I'll take this, and I'll say, first of all, before I take it, thank you everybody for participating. I want to keep everybody on track, and this will be the last question, but I encourage you all at any time to contact us, our offices, Lauren, myself, and any other APMA touchpoint you have. I'll thank Peter, of course, for always being helpful and useful and available, and the relationship between APMA and KPMG is one that is covers all our bases. Last time we got together was on cybersecurity, and also encourage you to touch base with Peter. His contacts will be available if you don't have them. Are any governments requiring PPEs in workplaces? The answer is no, but I also think we need to be smart about this. A lot of governments around the world, starting with Austria and then as close as New York State, are saying you can't be in public without a mask. And so I think we also have to start planning in our contingency that while they're not telling us now, when we develop protocols that I think will be like our usual health and safety protocols, a higher standard than the rest of the economy, you also have to contingency plan that at some point they may say that to you. Governments also know that there's a shortage in PPEs, so everybody's going to be a little bit sanguine. But it wouldn't hurt for you to start planning your inventory of PPEs in case it happens. Thank you, everybody. Lauren, Peter, to close.
Thanks, everyone, and stay safe, of course.
Thank you. And a reminder, we will post this online to share and for viewing, so you can expect it later today or Monday at the latest. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks, Laura.
Ciao, Peter.